instead of playing knight b4, white could have just played the move a5 for black. And this is a move he is very happy to make because the pawn sits significantly worse on a5 than a7. Why would that be? Let's put this on the board. Two main reasons. All right, so welcome everybody. I'm here to give the lecture tonight as a guest lecture on The Secret Life of Pawns. I understand this is a normal weekly session, but hopefully I can be a guest and provide some kind of decent commentary. So for those who don't know me, my name's Sam Shankland. I'm from California, but I am a pretty frequent visitor to St. Louis, where among other events I like to play includes the US Championship, which was won by some joker this year that didn't deserve to win, but you know, everyone gets lucky now and then. But what I've done recently as well is I've written a book called Small Steps to Giant Improvement, Master Pawn Play in Chess. And it's all about pawns and whatnot. So I thought while I was in St. Louis, it might be great to talk a bit about pawns and the secret life of pawns as we're speaking about. So what we see here in this position in front of us looks nothing like pawns. It's sort of a typical rook endgame. White is one pawn up, but Black's structure is very solid, and everyone who's played rook endgames in their life knows that they have tendency to end in draws. White's extra pawn is on the queen side, where Black's king is sitting pretty comfortably. And if White were to just, in the style of a true caveman, say, you know what, my extra pawn's on the queen side, let's just start trading stuff until I make a passed pawn, he's probably not going to win the game. This pawn on c4 is very well controlled. It's going to be very hard to get the Black king out of the way. There's still chances, and it's not like the players are just going to agree a draw here, but clearly something is not, it's missing. It's like the extra pawn is not working well enough. So what I specifically wrote about in my book is the concept that pawns do not move backwards. This is a very basic rule of chess that I'm sure everyone here knows, but its simple principles can go a long way. And I broke down a lot of the key reasons that pawns would want to move backwards in my book. Now, those 5 reasons in order are: 1, the pawn becomes vulnerable. It's just simply too far advanced in the opponent's camp, be rounded up and captured, or potentially could be harassed. 2 would be that the pawn advancing has loosened your control over key squares or blocked a key line or something like that, or opened a key line that your opponent can use. 3 would be it blocks your pieces. 4 would be that it compromises your king safety. And 5 would be that it makes a hook. Now in this position, I think we can all agree that neither king is going to feel too much danger. We can probably discount the part about king safety. Nobody has any pawns that are so far advanced that you worry about them getting captured. So what really we're going to be talking about here is the weaknesses of squares. So at this point, White has to figure out how to proceed in the endgame. We've already seen that the caveman's approach of just trying to set your passed pawn in motion, mobilize your 3-on-2 majority, doesn't seem to yield the proper benefits that we'd like. So at this point, I'd like to invite everyone to take a little bit of time and think to themselves, what should White play in this position, and how should he best try to increase his advantage? Is that a hand? Can White play a5? Yes, you can, and I believe that's the second best move. You are happy to have played a5. You don't want these pawns looking at each other. Just a general principle to keep in mind, simple principles go a long way, is when you're ahead in material, you want to trade pieces. When you're behind, you want to trade pawns. As such, White would like to avoid pawn trades, and a move like a5 potentially fixes the a6 pawn as a weakness. This definitely is a good idea. It is, in my opinion, the second best move, but I think White has something more pressing that he'd like to get done first.
My 2 ideas is king d3 or pawn to f3.
Okay, and what is the objective of such moves?
The objective is to position my king, or to trade the rooks up at the right moment when.
Right. Do you think Black will agree to a rook trade?
No.
No. So you can certainly play a move like f3 or king e4 as this or king d3 as this gentleman has suggested to try to prepare for rook e4. And we'll see that this theme does come up later in this endgame. But for the moment, it doesn't seem to accomplish very much. Let's say you go king d3 and I don't know, Black just wastes a move and plays rook e7, and after rook e4, Black gives a check. You didn't trade rooks. It doesn't feel like you've accomplished too much just yet. I think there's a much more important move first. Yes?
Something direct like rook f4.
Okay, so rook f4 has been suggested. Can you explain to me the purpose of this move?
To do something with pawns on king side, and either like to reach f6 square and
Right.
king back,
So rook f4 is a dual-purpose move. First of all, you're threatening to simply grab the pawn on f7. You're one pawn up, which may or may not be enough to win. If you take a second pawn, you're very likely to win the game. So black has to do something about the threat to this pawn on f7. Now, rook f4 is the best move, and it was played. In the game, black played f5, which I believe is the most resilient response. But let's suppose he were to play rook e7 instead. How should white proceed now?
Rook f6.
Yes, rook f6 check. And now we're seeing that black, the pawn on a6, is weak. And this is another key point when I'm saying you don't want to be trading pawns when you're ahead material. If the moves a takes b5 and a takes b5 had been included, and in this position black did not have a hanging pawn on a6 because it had already been exchanged, black maybe could consider advancing the king instead of retreating. As such, now after the king is forced back to b7, and now after a5, black's position is completely hopeless. He's stuck. His rook is stuck on the 7th rank. His king is stuck defending a6. So in addition to white being a pawn up, black is absolutely paralyzed. And white's most basic winning plan is to just run the king straight to d6, where it will harass this rook. And then he can start playing b3 and c4 once the king is active. Black is completely lost, and there's no discussion to be had. So, but that represents very poor defense on black's part, and the best move is, of course, instead of rook e7, to play f5. Now this has the key point of it saves the pawn that you have just attacked, while also preventing you from playing rook f6. But remember, the point of this is that pawns do not move backwards. As it turns out, I believe it's very much in white's favor to have provoked black's pawn to f5. Why do you guys think that might be?
G4.
Sorry, say that again?
Trying for G4.
Well, the problem if you played g4 is that, remember what we were saying, is we're trying to avoid the exchange of pawns. Now a whole bunch of pawns are being exchanged. Yeah, I suppose you could do this, but now there's so many pawns being chopped off that I would think after something like rook f8, black is starting to get very good holding chances. It's going to be very annoying to hang on to this pawn. If you start playing something like this and I give check, and then I give check again, if I simplify to 3-on-2 on one side, it's definitely a draw.
G3.
Okay, and then I give you this check, and then I come back to f4. I think that, I don't know, I mean, maybe you still have some winning chances because you can play a5 here, but it's quite clear that you're not happy that so many pawns are being exchanged. So this wasn't the reason. g4 is not the right idea. But it is important that we've provoked the pawn to f5. Yes, sir, in the back.
Are you going to try and attack g6 at some point?
Yes, at some point we are going to try to attack g6. By playing f5, black has not only weakened this pawn on g6, which will become a long-term weakness, but he's also weakened a lot of the key squares like f4 and g5 that potentially your king could go to harass. So let's see how the game proceeded to some extent. White did not play g4. Sorry, I have to look at my other computer here. So after f5, white played h4, natural enough to fix these pawns as they stand. And after rook e6, this gentleman's move here was played, a5, to keep the pawns from being exchanged. And black still has nothing to do. His pieces are about as active as they can get. So he plays rook e5. Now what should white do? Yes?
When you play rook f4 and then rook e3, and when they play rook d5, can you play rook c2? And
Sorry, you want rook f3 and rook e3, and then after rook d5, then what?
c2, and then
King c2.
yeah.
Yes. You're on the right track, but you need to expand upon your idea. Yes.
Same thing, but king e2, f3, king f4.
Right. White's plan to win the game now is to bring his king straight to g5, where he will harass the g6 pawn. Now, it seems like there's a problem that the white king is cut off along the e file that the black rook is controlling so nicely. But now we see one of the points of white's extra pawn. While it's not actually in any danger of becoming a queen right now, it does mean that black absolutely cannot allow a king and pawn endgame. Now, rook f3 may have been faster than what was done. I don't really mind what was played. White brought his rook back to d4. And after rook e8, he played rook d3. White had all the time in the world. Maybe this was a wasted move. Maybe it wasn't. Doesn't really matter. And then after rook d3, black is in a really bad spot because what's going to happen is white's going to play rook e3. He can also play b4 at some point if he wants to. In the game, black played rook b8, which in my view is just capitulation. But let's say black were to just sit with something like this. And now, if you want, you can play b4 just to make sure there's no weaknesses whatsoever, but I don't think it's necessary. Let's start with rook e3. Because we have an extra pawn, black is unable to trade these rooks. This king and pawn endgame is routinely winning for white because now the extra pass pawn will matter. But so let's say black is more adamant and wants to avoid an exchange of rooks. Now after king to e2, first of all, rook e6 check is a big threat that black has to take care of. Let's say he plays rook d6. And now we see this. if black's pawn were back on f7 as it was in the start of this exercise, black could play moves like rook f6 check to force the king back. He could play a move like f6 to keep the white king from invading the king side. As is specifically because white has provoked this pawn to f5, he has a very clear plan of bringing the king in to take this weak g6 pawn. Once the king reaches g5, he should win very easily by swinging the rook into the back rank. So in black, seeing that this was going to happen, that there wasn't really anything he could do to stop it, he tried rook b8. Now, I don't really want to criticize him too much because I believe his position was lost no matter what he did. And with rook b8, you could at least see he has a plan to potentially play b4 and make counterplay, but it's pretty hard to believe. And white could, again, play b4 if he so desired, but I'd take no issue with what he did, which was king e3. And after b4, king f4, bc3, white took with the rook. And after king d5, king g5, rook takes b2, f4. For one key moment, white actually has even given back his pawn in an endgame where originally white was a pawn up. Now we see nominally equal material on the board, but of course that doesn't matter in the slightest because what white has gotten for it was a clear path into the position with his king, who is now about to ransack black's king side, and there wasn't much more resistance to be had. So following rook a2, king g6, and rook a5, it's very clear whose pawns are more dangerous. And after king takes h5, just to point out, king takes f5 is not to be recommended. Anyone want to point out why? Yes, sir. Yeah, you can never trust these kids in the endgames, but if they see a tactic to win the rook, they will always find it. So no, that is absolutely correct, and this would be a great way to lose a winning game. But after king takes h5, white should win very routinely. The game continued king d4, rook b3, rook b5, rook a3, a5, king g5, and it's very clear that the white h-pawn is significantly faster than the black a-pawn, and well, the game just lasted a few more moves. King e4, h5, rook b8, h6, rook g8 check, king f6, and black had decided he'd seen enough at this point. So I thought this was a very nice example of a case where we saw a pawn that clearly wanted to move backwards. Now, the first several chapters of my book are about trying to keep your own pawns from moving too far forward to create weaknesses in your position. And while it's certainly good to avoid hurting yourself in that regard, you definitely, in order to ultimately win a chess game, sometimes points fall into your lap, sometimes opponents make mistakes unprovoked, this can happen. But if we go back to how black actually ended up with his pawn on f5, which turned out to be a huge weakness when white's king came in, can we blame black for playing the move f5 when he did? Absolutely not. I'm sure black probably understood that, maybe he understood at the time that f5 was a strategic detriment. Maybe he just made the move and hit the clock because he had to and there was no other choice. He didn't bother to think about it. But clearly, white just afforded him no choice in the matter. And the second section of my book is about situations like this, where you're specifically trying to provoke opponents' pawns forward in a way that becomes a problem for their position. Now here, we're specifically talking about, I would say, the second reason. The first reason being that the pawn could become vulnerable. Here you might argue that the g6 pawn becomes vulnerable by all this, but the g6 pawn was not the pawn that was moving. It was the f5 pawn, the f7 pawn that was moving. And when we provoked this f7 pawn forward, it lost control over the key squares g5 and g6. g5 to let the white king in, and then g6 to take the pawn. And provoking your opponent's pawns forward to weaken key squares is a very important theme that we'll see all throughout chess in every phase of the game, opening, middle game, and endgame. Now, this position was featured in my book, but it's a little-known fact that since my book came out, I've had a pretty good run. I won the U.S. Championship, I won the Capablanca Memorial, I raised my ratings to my peak high. Now, I like to think that most of this is because I've been working hard and that work is finally starting to pay off, but it's possible that writing my book had something to do with it. And I've definitely noticed in my own play that I'm noticing these themes consciously a little bit more than I was before I wrote the book. So what I'd like to do now is show a couple of games that I've played recently that I played after this book came out, but where I became more consciously aware of the kind of pawn weaknesses we're talking about, and specifically the concept of trying to provoke your opponent's pawns forward to weaken a key square. So the database here isn't updated enough, so I have to just copy this position in by hand, but that's okay. Also, if anybody wants to look up this game later, the game was Fedorchuk against Svirts from Poland-Ukraine match 2012. So let me just show a game that I played here. Cannot save that. This one was my game against a Wonder Liang from the last round of the U.S. Championship that clinched me the gold medal. So the beginning phase of the game was certainly interesting and I think worthy of study, but a little bit outside the scope of what I'm hoping to discuss. But I'd like to, I guess probably it's faster to just play the moves than to set up the position because there's fewer clicks. So we're just going to go through e4, c6, d45, chop, chop, knight c6. Don't give me the little spinning beach ball of doom. Knight f6, bishop f4, bishop g4, queen b3, and I wonder, played e5, but luckily I was ready with h3. He should have played knight a5 here. So takes, check. Again, I'm skipping through this because it's not relevant to what I was hoping to discuss. g6, rook e1, queen c7, g5, bishop e2. Knight e6, bishop b5. So I want to start here. Now at this point, a wonder played bishop g7. This may well be the best move, but I was certainly, because I'm planning on potentially taking on c6 and jumping into e5 with a knight, which would cause problems. But as soon as he played bishop g7, even if it's best, I'm going to be a pretty happy guy because this bishop's going to be a very sad piece. So here, white is clearly better. He has a better structure. His pieces are more active. The bishop on g7 and the knight on e6 do not inspire confidence, and white's rook on h1 is more active than the rook on h8. That said, while it's clear white has the better end of this position, it's not so clear what he's going to do to increase his advantage further. Black's position is very solid, and there's no real weaknesses just yet. I mean, we could argue about d5 being a weakness, but it's protected for now, and it's very hard to see how white's going to increase the pressure on it with any of his other pieces. But I forget who said it first, but there's a very true part of chess, which is that one bad piece makes a bad position. So what is white's bad piece here? Yes?
Knight on d2.
Yeah, the knight on d2 is not very good. It can't come to b3 or f3. It's dominated by the d5 pawn. White's position apart from this knight on d2 is sort of picture perfect. Everything else makes really good sense, but the knight on d2 needs to improve. And it's not so easy to see how. But does anyone want to come up with a plan for how this knight can be improved? Yeah.
King g1, knight f1, knight h2.
And what does the knight do on h2?
Knight g4 to maybe h6 or e5.
Okay, so king g1, knight f1, knight h2. On a scale from snail to cheetah, where does this lie? Probably closer to the snail, right? Yeah, this is very slow. And black is not without counterplay. I think if he has an option, he would like to play h6 pretty soon to potentially open the h file. But it's an interesting idea. What we want to do is, and clearly the knight doesn't have so many great options, and you're right that moving a piece to clear a square is a pretty good idea. But the white knight has a better route to join the game. Yes?
Knight h2 and then knight d2 to f3.
Okay, so if you were trying to bring the knight to h2, then knight h2 would be faster. But again, I don't really think it accomplishes that much, and in the meantime, the g5 pawn is hanging. And when the g5 pawn falls, a lot of white's bind will go away, plus he's a pawn down. So this isn't best either. Let's play this like Bughouse. Let's take this knight. Imagine this knight's just off the board, and we can drop it somewhere. Where do we want to put it? This is a good way to try to figure out how to improve the knight. D3, yes. D3, I think, is an excellent square for the knight. It's potentially looking at e5 and c5, which are both weak. It's potentially harassing the f4 pawn. None of these squares right now look that great because they're under control. But white can potentially provoke weaknesses, and then the knight on d3 will be excellent. So what's the best way for the knight to get to d3?
Queen a4.
Yes. Queen a4 is the best move. This also carries the incidental threat of bishop takes c6, which would severely compromise black's pawn structure. So if black were to try to proceed along with his own play with something like h6, and let's say we chop everything, and then go bishop takes c6, and black has to take with the pawn because otherwise queen a7 comes. A position like this one looks awful for black. His king is going to come under serious fire. You might play b4 just to fix this pawn as hard as you can, and then knight b3 comes, and knight c5 or knight a5, and the black king is going to get taken for a ride. This is not going to be fun for black. So queen a4 comes with a tempo. The queen wasn't doing that much on b3. Black really does not want to allow white to force this pawn structure. Even if he was able to do so in a way that forced the queens off, Something like this, I think, is just an absolutely miserable endgame for black because white will play knight b3, and these pawns on a6 and c6 will prove to be long-term weaknesses, and white has plans to play stuff like knight b3 and say knight c5 to remove the knight on e6, and then rook h4 comes, and the pawn on f4 will likely be lost. This looks pretty hopeless. So a wonder found the best move with rook d6. And his point is that if bishop c6, he's able to keep his pawn structure intact because now queen a7 would fail to rook a6. This is a bad way to lose the US championship. But here I was able to execute my idea with knight b3. I think the computer preferred b4, but from a human point of view, this is just nonsense because it allows black to actually have a plan to play against the c3 weakness. And I think knight b3 makes a lot more sense. So another thing is when you put pressure on people, they start to voluntarily worsen their own position. And here, my plan during the game was next move to play knight c1. But where else could the knight on b3 look to go? Knight c5 is a serious idea as well. Now, I don't know if a wonder had played king b8 or something. I don't know if I would have played knight c1 or knight c5. I didn't have to make that decision. But if white is able to bring his knight to c5, he can potentially get rid of this e6 knight, which is keeping the e file closed, keeping the f4 pawn protected. And that could be a real problem for black. Again, it wasn't my idea, but it's something that black has to keep in mind. I was expecting a6, and following bishop c6, rook c6, the best move is knight c5. But my plan was knight c1. In any case, by provoking things like this, a wonder played b6. And this, after this, I believe black's position is beyond saving. Why is b6 such a bad move?
Light squares.
Exactly. He's weakened the light squares. Now, in this case, I did not force him to play b6, but I sort of encouraged it. I definitely provoked it, even if it wasn't completely forced. I mean, I think after a6, black is worse, but the game goes on. And here, I think it was largely because I put a wonder under pressure, and I made moves that sort of enticed him to play the weakening move b6 that he did it. I don't think a wonder didn't understand this as a weakening move. I think he just sort of felt he didn't have that much choice in the matter. And as a result, I was able to provoke my opponent's pawn forward in a way that severely compromised his position. Moving forward, I now executed my plan to bring my knight to d3. He went knight b8, knight d3, and king b7. Okay, what is black's plan? Yeah, so black wants to play a6. In addition to that, seeming like it will trap the bishop and win material on the spot, there's just a general rule of thumb. You want your pawns to be on the same color as your opponent's bishop in opposite colored bishop positions, because right now my bishop on b5 is the boss of the board. All right, black's plan is a6. What should white do?
Knight b4.
Yeah, knight b4 is a very strong move. Now, I'm preventing black from playing a6. The knight seems pretty active. It could potentially threaten the d5 pawn as well. Let's say black plays a5. This knight just has to go right back where it came from. Did we just lose time? All right. Well, you just made two moves back to back, knight b3 to knight d3 to b4, and now so black had a bad position. Let's repeat the position. Why don't black play a5 to a7? This is the whole point. Pawns do not move backwards. White's basically just burned two tempi on knight b4 to d3, but essentially if you look at this position a second ago, if black had played a5, which maybe he had to do, instead of playing knight b4, white could have just played the move a5 for black. And this is a move he is very happy to make, because the pawn sits significantly worse on a5 than a7. Why would that be? Let's put this on the board. Two main reasons. Why is the pawn worse on a5 than a7?
King's position is easier to be opened now.
Yes, that's correct. King's position is easier to be opened. b4. This is the concept of making a hook.
Later.
This is the concept of making a hook. b4 now becomes a very legitimate idea for white to open up black's king. Previously, if we go back several moves, and we saw where we picked up the position, we're like, yeah, white's better, but it's hard to find a plan to increase his advantage, and it's hard to see how to break through. When we move forward and we see what I did to provoke the black pawn to b6, here we go, knight b3, and then yeah. Once we've seen the pawn provoked to b6, we've weakened some squares. And to some extent, that was a wonder playing it voluntarily. It was a mistake after all. But then here, I mean, if a5 was the best move, which it may well have been, although I do think it's lost, by playing knight b4, I sort of forced black to play a5. He didn't have a choice in the matter. And after knight d3, I've made a hook in his position on a5. I can now play b4 to open up his king in a position where I previously was struggling to find a plan. In addition, this bishop on b5, which thoroughly dominates the knight on b8, is now stuck on b5 for the rest of the game, as black no longer has the a7 to a6 advance to boot the bishop off of its perch. Make sense to everybody? So I think this is what black had to do. Now, Wander played queen d8, which, I think his position was more or less lost, so I don't want to criticize him too much, but this definitely hastened the defeat because I had to calculate a line here, and now I just want to show it because while the calculation and tactics in this game are certainly interesting and important to go over, it is outside the scope of what I want to talk about, which is just the premise of pawns not moving backwards and sort of the secret life of pawns, so to speak. The best move now is knight e5, and it's a hard move to see because you really don't want to let black trade this stupid bishop on g7 for a knight because that bishop was such a bad piece. You're also hanging the e5 pawn, the g5 pawn, but if you start calculating, you realize that black's position just falls apart. That knight e5 makes twin threats of knight f7 and knight c6. So black can play knight takes g5 and avoid one such threat, but after knight c6, black is facing massive problems after something like takes, queen a6, queen a7, rook e7, and knight d8 are all massive threats. This just completely falls apart on the spot. That's not too hard to figure out. But if bishop takes e5, this looks like black is achieving a great deal strategically by trading off such a bad bishop. But unfortunately for him, we're seeing the tactics. This rook is trapped. Now, I had to calculate a little bit because he can play knight c5 to attack my queen and try to clear up the e6 square for his rook. But the variations are pretty straightforward and very nice. Still, does anyone want to try to find the win for white here? Let's think of it first. This is forcing chess. Checks and captures. Always have to consider those first when looking at forcing combinations. Okay, so e takes d6 has been called. This sacrifices the queen. After knight takes a4, let's be keeping track of material. Excuse me. Right. So at the moment, white is down queen for a rook, but now rook e7 check comes and black's in a quandary. If he takes the rook, now material is equal, but both a4 is hanging and e8 queen is coming. Black's clearly going to lose this. So let's say he tries to save the king. What if he plays king c8? Right, rook c7, this would be checkmate, if not this. Now material is equal again, and once again, two hanging pieces. So white will be a piece up in the endgame. And finally, if king to a8, which is probably the most resilient, but white definitely still wins. Yeah, knight c6 is the best move. And here, rook takes a7 is checkmate and a very serious threat. If bishop c6, I believe this also wins, but after knight c6, black's going to have to give up the queen for the rook. And at this point, at least the pawn doesn't become a queen like right away because we don't have a light squared bishop anymore. It still should be winning, as I don't think rook takes h7 can be stopped, but you might end up in something like this. I don't know, knight d8 and knight f7. It should win, but it's a little bit more work. It's better to start with knight c6 when rook a7 mate is a massive threat. If queen e7, d e7, and the e-pawn will win. And if knight takes c6, bishop c6 check, and it just checks all the way through. Rook b7 check. If king a8, rook b6 is mate, and if king c8, d7 comes. So, so this variation is nice. Not wildly difficult, but still, even in the most positional of games, you want to be calculating some lines. Anyhow, with both knight f7 and knight c6 being massive threats, Wander felt the need to play queen c7, and then after queen b3, the game is basically over because knight takes d5 is coming, and once the d5 pawn falls, there's really not much to fight for. He tried rook d8, but now keep in mind that the d8 square is occupied again, so after the rook takes h7, which the rook had to leave, I've won a pawn. Again, knight g5 impossible because the bishop hangs, and again, bishop e5 impossible because after de, the rook is again trapped because the d8 square is occupied. Wander had his one opportunity to play a6, bishop d3. And if black could play a5 here, which he really wants to take this knight on e5. The problem is if he takes it now, after rook takes e5, the d5 pawn will fall as well. What he'd really like to do is play a5, kick my knight away, and now take this guy. And here he's still in big trouble, but he's sort of fighting back. After something like this, he's not falling apart right away. The g5 pawn is going to potentially fall. But unfortunately for him, Oh, is ready? He didn't play a5, but if he did, yeah, knight takes d5, and after rook takes d5, bishop e4, it's just complete collapse. The rook on d5 is lost, and if queen d6, knight f7, and everything hangs. So this was routinely winning. So for one critical move, black was not able to play a5. He got his king off of this diagonal first. But once again, white has another very nice move here to provoke one of black's pawns forward to weaken his position. What should white play? Probably black is ready to play a5 next, so you want to be ready for that.
Queen e4 again.
Yeah, queen a4 back. The queen has served her purpose on b3. She attacked the d5 pawn, brought black's rook to d8, which in turn allowed the h1 rook to snap on h7. Now the threat of taking on a6 is completely crushing, so black must play a5. And what square has he weakened?
B4.
What should we do? Sorry?
Knight C2.
But after knight c2, black will take on e5, and here he's sort of fighting back. He should be lost, but the whole goal was to not let black take on e5. What should we do with this weakened? When you played a5, what score did you weaken?
C6.
No, it was c6. The pawn on pawn on a6.
A6.
Pawn on a6. What score was it controlling that it doesn't control anymore?
B5.
How can we use this score to our
Bishop comes-
yeah? The bishop comes right back. Because the queen's on a4, this knight cannot be taken on account of the pin. The bishop comes right back to the best square it was on. Again, bishop e5 is prevented because of de. And now, because the bishop is back on b5 as opposed to on d3, the rook is once again trapped. And then after king b7, the knight comes back to d3. We saw a similar position not too long ago where white didn't even, where we were saying black should have played a5 way back when. In this position, after a5, knight d3, black's position is really bad, and it seems basically lost because b4 is coming and he has no counterplay and all the squares are weak. If we go forward to the way the game actually went, black was facing all of the same problems, except if you look, sorry, not a5, king a7, queen a4, a5, bishop b5, king b7. Incidentally here, white, like bishop e8 was collapsed, but I just didn't care. I was looking for the simplest moves. After knight d3, we have all the same problems, except in addition to that, black is now a clean pawn down, and my one semi-passive piece on h1 has entered the game on h7. The rest of this game I don't think is too important to go over for our purposes, although I was a little bit more stressed out than normal playing it because I knew I was completely winning, but I also knew 50 grand was potentially in the pocket with a win, and it's a fair amount of money to be stressed out over. Anyhow, I'd like to move on to another game that I played recently. I think this was a good example of showing how provoking the black pawns forward on the queen side seriously compromised this position and let me take down the US Championship. So the next game I want to look at is a game I played in my most recent event, which was a private match with Peter's Fiddler. And now, while I actually lost the match, I won the first game and in fine style, which left me pretty optimistic. But then he struck back with a beautiful game in game two. So we were even at 1-1, where I thought we both played really well in the first two games, me in game one, him in game two. Then in games 3, 4, and 5, I really let it slip. I lost game 4 from like a fine position. In games 3 and 5, I missed some chances. Ultimately, I lost the match, but it was a good learning experience. But I want to go over the first game, the one I won, not specifically because I won it, but because it really had a lot to do with the concept of pawns not moving backwards, while the games I lost were more to do with the concept of my king getting slaughtered, which was not much fun, but props to Peter for playing well. Let me pull up this position. So I had played a pretty good game for the most part, but I had somewhat let it slip. So let me get this position here. Rook on d3, pawn on b3 and a4, rook on c2, rook on e6, here. So we see another rook endgame. Here. So I had played a quite good game for the most part, but I was definitely winning at some point, and here I've made my life a bit difficult. I'm still one pawn up in this rook endgame, but my pieces are a bit passive. And I actually think if Peter had found the right move here, he would have drawn, and we'll come back to that at the end because we'll see what happened. But he played rook b2, which I think was... I think this move should lose the game. I'm not 100% confident because there's other defensive resources, but well, let's discuss this position a little bit. White's a pawn up, but why is he not winning, or at least not clearly winning? Yes.
No pass pawn.
Yeah, he has not passed pawns yet, but there's a much bigger reason.
4 rooks.
Yeah, the 4 rooks, but specifically, how about activity? Yes, sir.
He has to hold on, so it's hard for him to make a pass pawn.
Hard to make a pass pawn, yeah, but I don't think White wants to make a pass pawn. He wants to win pawns. Yes.
Black can play like rook e2, and rook e6 to e2, and get active rooks.
The real problem, I would say, is that White's pieces are passive. So, for example, okay, in the game he played rook to b2, but Black could play a move like rook e2. I have to play rook g3 now, and White's pieces are horribly passive. Black must now retreat since the b6 pawn is hanging, but we see a position like this one come. And White's king and his g3 rook are really not very inspiring. And as a result, it's hard to see how he's going to make progress. So after rook b2, I played, I think, a very strong move, h4. And the point of this, first of all, I want to advance h5 to gain more space. But the real thing is I really want the h3 square to be clear for my king. And we'll see why in a second. So rook b2, h4. So Svidler found nothing better than rook e to e2. And I mean, I could try rook takes b6, but something like this, I think, if I want to avoid a draw, I have to stop touching the rook at some point. And, well, clearly Black's getting his own pass pawns, and this is much more double-edged. If I had to do that to get any winning chances, I would have seriously considered it, but I thought I had found a better plan. So rook g3, and again, Black has to bring the rook back to e6. But we need a plan for White to win the game. I started with h5, which I think is best, but okay, now he marked time with rook b6. Let's talk in a bit more detail here. Let's see if anyone can come up with the plan for White to win the game. Any thoughts? Move the king up. So king h3. The problem is king h3, rook d1 threatens mate, and I think you have to just come right back. Sorry?
Yeah, basically loses the vote just by go back to h2.
King back to h2, you mean?
But then just by Black playing rook d1, White's lost the tempo.
Well, you'll repeat the position. After king h2, you'll have to play king back to h2, and then Black will have to play rook back to d6. So no harm done. You made a mistake. Repeat the position. Find a better move. It's always nice when you can do that. Sometimes if you make a mistake, you don't have the option to repeat the position. But okay, here we need a plan to win the game. We've clearly seen making a pass pawn with something like b4 will never work. Among other things, rook d4 will just take it. So what's White going to actually do? It seems like Black has all of his weaknesses under control. But he has a plan.
To open a king somehow,
Yes, you need to open the Black king.
or
You would-
use it somehow. Like g5 is a main idea.
White playing g5?
Yeah.
But this goes back to what we were saying earlier. We don't want to trade so many pawns. What you want to do is find another weakness in Black's position. This rook here is serving no defensive roles whatsoever. It's serving an active role.
If rook b5 can move to b7 somehow.
That's going to be difficult, but the rook getting from b5 to b7 is going to be tough. But you're on the right track. What is that rook? What are you trying to do with your rook on b7?
b5, rook e7, and do something with f7.
Right. You want to attack the f7 pawn. The problem with rook f3 is Black will play rook to e2. Rook to d2, excuse me.
Second rook is free for now, so rook e5,
What's the point of rook e5? Where do you want to go?
rook e7.
Maybe. I like rook b4 more. White wants to bring his rook to f4 and then bring his other rook to f3. When this happens, Black will have a very difficult decision of what to do about the f7 pawn.
And then rook comes to f6 like that.
Right, that creates a serious problem for black. He doesn't even need rook f6. Let's suppose black were taking his typical strategy of just waiting, and then black plays here. If rook,
Yeah, rook f6 here.
but then maybe rook takes b3. This may still be winning after rook b3 and rook b6, but I'm not sure. But I think the real thing is here, now black's rook is stuck in the passive role, not yours. Now your king is free. He's not playing rook d2 anymore. You're able to start making progress. Now, whether this is enough to win the game, I don't know. I mean, we'll find out. But clearly, white's starting to make progress. He's got his king free. He's got his rooks free. At some point, I can play a move like rook back to b4. Let's say black keeps waiting. What if I play rook back to b4? Now, if you play rook e2, what if I run with my king? I give you g2 and I take b6. This looks like a very serious chance for white. My king's not in any danger anymore, and it's going to take you forever to get your pawns going. This seems like a decent try. Anyhow, after rook b4, Svidler quite clearly understood what my plan was, and he played g5. But I was extremely happy to see this move because I have provoked his pawn forward to weaken an important square. What does white do? Rook right back to b5. So a second ago we're like, well, I'll play rook b4 and then I'll play rook b5 back. But again, black cannot play g5 back to g6. Now white still has the same plan at his disposal to play first rook f5 and then rook f3 to harass this pawn. So after g5 here, black played f6. Now, I think this was impatient. He definitely could have at least waited for me to put rooks on the f-file to play f6, but he played it here. Now, the position has changed dramatically because the black king has been opened. What should white play? Yes?
Rook c3.
Okay, rook c3. Let's say black plays rook to d2. Whose king is in more danger? Do we have to come back to g3, or has the pawn on f6 caused a problem for black?
So check, king back.
King where? Let's say f8, and now?
Rook takes b6.
Right, and as it turns out, yeah, okay, we won the pawn. We were always winning the pawn when black doubled his rooks on the second rank. But instead of just winning the pawn, now black's king's also in the smasher. And following rook takes g2 check, black is one tempo too slow. I'll play king h1. You can check me forever, but eventually my king will run to c1 where the rook controls this square. You can give me all the checks you want. Doesn't matter which rook you choose, this one, that one. Ultimately, my king comes back here. No more checks, rook b8 mate is coming. And as soon as black has to make a passive move like this one, white will easily win with his pawns. Black's king is clearly in more danger than white's, and white will win. So this seems like it's winning, but only because I was able to encourage black to play f6 by trying to bring my rooks to the f-file. Now, instead here, Svidler found a pretty clever move, I think, with rook to e2. And his point with this is if I play something like rook c7 check, king f8, I don't have an immediate way to get this rook to b8. I can play something like a5, but this is one critical tempo slower. And now after rook d2, we see the point of rook e2 from b2 is these rooks are closer. And here my king doesn't get to the c-file because the black rook on d2 is in the way, and this is a perpetual. These 2750 guys, they're tough.
Can you go to h3 instead of h1? To check and run to
I
e4 and f5 and go.
think this, I'm not sure this will work. Here, check, king e4. Let me think.
This changes a lot.
Yeah, maybe this works too. Let me think. a5, rook d2, rook b6, check, king h3, check. This way. Okay, maybe this is winning, but it's not so easy. For example, let's say we follow this line, and then let's go maybe this rook with check. And then you come king e4, and then I play rook f4 check. And then I'll give you this check. And then let's say I'm ready with rook c2 check, rook takes, okay, this should win. I don't know, there was some reason I disliked this. I'm trying to remember it. But maybe this was also winning. But I liked what I did even more. So rook c3, rook e2. Now that I've provoked f6, I thought I just needed to bring pieces in, and what I came up with was my rook coming to b5 was to play rook to f5 to try to get f6 through. Now once that happened, I just brought my rook back to b4. My point is now simple. This rook's coming to c4 and then coming into the position. black played rook d2, and after rook g3, back. We've had this whole crazy dance this entire time, but what I've done is provoked the pawns to g5 and f6, and as a result now moves like rook b4 to c7 are accomplishing something when they weren't before. So instead of this, Svidler tried king f7, and I played rook c4, king e6, and now he's managed to get his king out of the smasher, but now he's abandoned his h-pawn. So after rook to c8, which threatens rook e8 check among others, the game promptly ended. So I brought the rook back to g3, and here Svidler realized I'm coming for his h6 pawn, so he tried to come back, but after rook h8, there's nothing to be done. If he plays king g7, white plays rook b8. And I think it was you who mentioned a long time ago you wanted to put the rook on b7 on the other side. It took a long time, but white eventually got to where you wanted. Now here, black's in a tough spot because his b6 pawn is hanging. If he tries to save it, he frees the g3 rook, and after rook b7 check and rook c3, black does not have time to come back to d2 because of mate, and white finally wins. Instead, Svidler played rook f2, pointing out that if rook takes h6, king g7, and now my rook will get trapped. And it's not like it's getting taken, but both of my rooks are completely stuck, and I don't see how I break through. But one more accurate move finished the game. Anyone want to find it? Yes, rook h7. And now black's in a tough spot because he has to either let his king get cut off on the back rank with something like king g8, when after rook b7 he's facing mating threats again, or if he wants to avoid that, he can play king e6, but now I can safely take the pawn on h6 because he cannot jail my rook. So I was very happy with this game, and this was really the bright spot of what was otherwise a frustrating and tough match for me. He was a very tough opponent, and he won a very nice match. But the first game I really liked, and I specifically liked how I was able to put the principles of my book into action of working hard to provoke your opponent's pawns forward in a way that they won't enjoy. In this case, provoking black into playing g6 to g5, and then provoking him into playing f7 to f6, critically weakened the 7th rank, which is what I used to get enough play to win the game when it looked like my pieces were kind of stuck. I think we can end that for now, but thanks everyone for coming, and this was fun.